By virtue of the authority vested in me as Regent of Pemigewasset Valley Chapter of the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, I now declare this meeting in session. Good morning, my name is Kathy Hargreaves, and I am the Regent of the Pemigewasset Valley Chapter. Please stand if you are able and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. You may sit. So I'm going to give you the 90-second version of what the DAR is, and then I will introduce our speaker this morning. I want to thank you all for coming out. The National Society Daughters of the American Revolution is a vibrant, non-profit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization dedicated to historic preservation, education, and patriotism. Founded in 1890, the DAR has a broad and meaningful service footprint. In education, the organization supports schools and awards and scholarships each year. Its commitment to patriotism includes active support of veterans and active duty military through programs and comfort items. In the areas of historic preservation, the DAR provides grants to qualified organizations for the restoration of buildings, artwork, and documents, and contributes hands-on service, including the restoration of our local Churchill Cemetery in Ashland. With nearly 190,000 members in over 3,000 chapters across 50 states, abroad, the DAR's collective impact is far-reaching. Members are women who are lineal descendants of patriots who aided in achieving American independence. By joining the DAR, women become a part of a lasting legacy of service and fellowship, united by a shared dedication to the ideals on which our nation was founded, and a commitment to making meaningful difference in their communities and beyond. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge that this event is made possible from a grant from New Hampshire Humanities. The New Hampshire Humanities connects people and ideas by funding and supporting programs across the state to inspire curiosity, foster civil dialogue, and encourage exploration of big questions. Now to our speaker. Margot Burns is the 10th generation great-granddaughter of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged in Salem in 1692 on the charge of witchcraft. She is the project manager and associate editor of Records of the Salem Witch Hunt, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. This work is a definitive collection of transcriptions of legal records of this episode. She has appeared in several documentaries about the Salem witchcraft trials. The Salem Witch Hunt examined the evidence for the Essex National Heritage Commission and the National Park Service. Salem Unmasking the Devil with Catherine Howe discussing the case of the Rebecca Nurse and the National Geographic for the National Geographic Channel, and it aired on BBC under an alternate title, The Salem Witch Trials Conspiracy. In 2016, Margot appeared with historian Mary Beth Norton in Season 7, Episode 2 of the TLC cable television series, Who Do You Think You Are?, which all of us genealogists in the room are complete devotees of. She was discussing Scott Foley's ancestor, Samuel Wardwell of Andover, Mass., who was one of the 19 people hanged during the Salem witchcraft trials. And she later appeared on this show with Emerson Baker in 2018, speaking with actress Jane Smart about their ancestor, Dorcas Poor. Without further ado, Margot Burns.
Thank you for coming out today. I usually speak in the evening, so I guess I've got a crowd that doesn't have to drive after dark to come see me. I would like to say a couple things about New Hampshire Humanities. Their budget got cut in half because half of it used to come from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I'm sure you're aware that there are a fair number of programs that have been cut at the federal level. However, there's still a fair amount of money, and they are sponsoring things regularly. They changed how to get them, so they have a rolling thing every quarter to get them. And they're also working on trying to get more programming to deserving communities, and especially up north. So they're really working very hard. They also have a lot of programming for Revolutionary War. That's the R and DAR, right? So I heartily recommend checking their website, and you can look through the catalog. So without any more ado, where am I? Oh, turn on-off switch to on position. Yes, that's how everything starts, according to my dad. Okay, this is the name of the talk, and it's good. I mean, that tells you what's going on. But the Humanities didn't want me to name it this. So I made sure it's in the show. But this is basically, I'm going to go through the legal records that show how they actually process these. It wasn't about pitchforks and torches. It wasn't, you think, oh, witches, hang the witch, hang the witch. No, it was paperwork. There's so much legal material available to look at all the different cases. Now, with anything in history, I like where. So, where was this taking place? This is a map, a Belgian map from 1665. And you notice it has all sorts of little things around the edges because it's a navigation map. But when you first look at it, you go, oh, what is there? Well, you can see Cape Cod. You can see Long Island, and notice it's all the little ins and outs because they needed to know where the shoreline or banks were. You can see the three big rivers. We've got the Hudson, the Connecticut, and the Merrimack. I'm going to talk about this area of the map. I mean, you're starting to see where things are with this once you get the idea. Older maps can be a little confusing at times. Where are we? Well, this is the area that gets even more confusing, because we're talking about Boston, and we're up into New Hampshire and a little into Maine. So just so you know, this is what it looks like today. We're more, let's see, yay, all these little teeny towns versus this. And there's Boston, there's Salem. So I like showing where things take place. We also have Great Bay. I think they thought it was greater than we do. But there was a lot of oystering, and it was very, very important to the economy at the time. So this is what it looks like today. And we have lots and lots of small towns. However, this is what it looked like in 1692. Lots of big towns, fewer people. Now, my cousin lived in Andover at one point, and I said something about Salem, people from Salem going next door to Andover because that was the next town over. And he said, no, it isn't. And I went, oh, okay, I'm thinking 1692. This is going. Hello? On-off switch to off on position. Okay, maybe, are we out of battery?
Already?
Is it working?
No, I have no battery.
Oh. How about this? No, okay. I'm going to talk in teacher voice, and if you can't hear me, raise your hand. Anyway, this is what it looks like, and you can see Salem and Andover actually have a border. But if you go to, well, let's go, present day, it doesn't. So he was thinking in terms of now. One of the things about these towns is that there are still towns with those names. They just have had things lopped off and new borders and different towns because different areas of these towns were very important. So in Andover, the stuff that took place in Andover accusations actually took place in a part of Andover that became North Andover. So when people are into history and they go, oh, my ancestor was from Andover, and they go to the Andover Historical Society, whoops, they really need to be going to the North Andover Historical Society. We're back. Yes. Was teacher voice okay?
Yes.
Teacher voice can get me into trouble. I was walking down the street one day and somebody flicked something on the ground and I almost said, excuse me? Okay, I can get myself into trouble that way. So here are all the towns. I don't know how well anybody knows about the Salem witchcraft trial, so I'm going to try and make sure that you get the basics of who was accusing whom. And in this case, if you've heard anything about the Salem witchcraft trials, the initial accusations were in Salem Village. Now this is a part of Salem. The town is now Danvers. So the first accusations were there, and they came in the home of the minister, Samuel Parris, and his daughter, and well, they sometimes call Abigail Williams his niece or kinfolk. We don't know exactly how she was related to the family, but his daughter Betty and Abigail Williams started having fits. And of course, what does a good Puritan minister do? He invites other ministers in to pray. So they prayed. They asked the local doctor to take a look. Things aren't getting better. And the doctor, some kind of medical doctor, right, said, well, I don't know, maybe it's witchcraft. And therein lies the tale, because then they're saying, oh, well, if it's witchcraft, Satan really hates Puritans. Satan hates Massachusetts. Satan hates my little village. Satan hates my parsonage. And now Satan is attacking my children. So whatever you hear about the minister, Samuel Parris, well, I give him a pass on that as far as responsibility is concerned, because that is how he saw it. He was protecting everything. So we got a few people being accused in Salem Village. Before long, people in Salem town were being accused. They're called the Salem witchcraft trials because the trials took place in Salem. A lot of times when people are telling a story about the Salem witchcraft trials, it makes it sound like it's just one town. No. Things were going on in other towns. So right around the time that the accusations are coming in late February, early March, that's when you think about them in 1692. But before that, there were a couple of other witchcraft accusations. One was in Chelmsford, a woman named Martha Sparks, and she was accused in October of 1691, the previous year. And around the same time, there was a woman, Rachel Hatfield Clinton, in Ipswich, who was being accused. So it wasn't like Salem Village was the only place. There were a lot of things that were sparking up, and people were very nervous about this. There was also, around that time, in January of 1692, there was a raid on York. Sometimes you'll hear it called the Candlemas Massacre, because it was in January on Candlemas. But that's sort of, politically, you want to see what's happening on all the sides. If you only tell one side of the story. So it's the raid on York. And they took 85 people prisoner and brought them to Quebec City to be ransomed. And they killed about 100 people. So this was brutal. And so there were a lot of people who were escaping stuff on the frontier. There were a lot of other communities and homes that were being attacked. So we see a lot of people coming down from the wilderness, and Essex County down here was getting a lot of the refugees. So there was a lot of anxiety about what was happening physically, never mind spiritually. So they have the reality of the attacks, and then the reality to them of the devil coming and attacking them. Before we're through, there are people in all these towns who are accused. So if you just read something and they talk about just what's going on in Salem Village, that's not the case. But there were 152 people who were accused across all these towns. And it's very hard to tell the story of Salem with that many cases. So many people just hear about the first ones because you can only hold so many things in your brain. So who were the people who were afflicted? Well, there's 2 little girls. And there was a dad who was also the minister. Double bonus. We have the people they accused. So there were 2 women named Sarah. Okay, that's one little thing. Then a woman who was a Native American enslaved person. So we got Tituba. That's 4 we got there. And then you got to throw in a judge. So they just pick Hathorne. So with that, you've got 5 things you can tell the story. The accusations, the prosecutions, all of that. If you've heard of somebody else, you might have an ancestor. Anybody else have an ancestor? Ooh, yay! Tell me.
Susanna Martin.
Susanna North Martin, all right. Over here?
Susanna. Mary Osgood.
Mary Esty, okay, cousins, because I got Rebecca Nurse. Anybody else want to tell me? Yep.
Rebecca Nurse.
Rebecca Nurse, cousin.
Mary Esty.
Mary Esty, yeah. They were sisters, Mary Esty and Rebecca Town. And they had a third sister, Sarah Cloyce. And basically they didn't manage to indict her. So her case went away. But still, she was in prison for a long time. Anybody else has somebody other than those? Yeah, Susanna North Martin is the most common person who comes up. So she must have been really, must have had a lot of kids. But she's very well known by people in New England and not necessarily outside. They might have heard of Rebecca Nurse. The other things you might hear about is the guy that got pressed to death under stones, Giles Corey. That was because he was trying to mess with the system. And it still happens today when you're when you're going before the bar and you're pleading guilty or not guilty. They ask you this question. You could pass on all sorts of things, but they ask you this question. And I even saw it on that Murdaugh case. You know, that tall guy who killed his wife and stuff out by the dog? Yeah, I watched when he was pleading before the bar, and they asked him this question: how do you wish to be tried? And the answer is, before God and my country. The country being the jury. Now, you could say I want to be tried by the magistrates, but Giles Corey wouldn't answer that question. And everything had to stop until he agreed to be tried, and he was in his 80s, and everybody else is getting convicted and hanged. I'll see what I can do. The punishment for that, which came from England, is if you tried to do that, they would spread you out on the ground, and then they would put boards on top of you and then pile stones until it was so heavy that you couldn't breathe and you died. Yeah. Now I thought, oh, this is really weird, but if you go through the mortality rolls in London, you'll find executed and 2 people pressed. So it was something that they did in England at the time. If you're really interested in this story, a friend of mine, a young man named Ben Wiki, has drawn a book. It's all illustrated it's called More Weight. Because supposedly as the weight was coming down, he's going, define, yeah, more weight out. So it's a graphic, it's graphic history. And if you really want to know the story of Giles Corey, I highly recommend it. Ben is a very talented young man, and it took him 10 years to do it, and he's 30, and I'm going, oh. So anyway, that aside, I'd love to give him plugs. He's very talented. Okay, we just did where. Now we're going to do when. So most of this took place in 1692. That's the year that you will hear. But here's good old Martha Sparks from over in Chelmsford. So that was here. And then a lot of people just think it was all 1692. But when they stopped the prosecutions in 1692, it still continued into 1693. Nobody made the magic wand and said, oh, we're all done, this is wrong, let's all go home. So, and on this part here, this pink part, that was 3 months when people were accusing each other and everybody was being jailed. So what you would do is you would go to the local magistrate and say, hey, I think Rebecca Nurse afflicted my daughter and I want to press charges. And in that 3 months, 70 people were accused and put in jail. Can you imagine? Because they weren't processing them, because they knew the new governor was coming and the new governor would have the charter, and that's how they would be able to start prosecuting them. If they started doing that before the new government came, well, that's not good. You want the new governor to say, okay, you're in charge. So when he arrived in late May, there were 70 people in custody. And to read his letters to the crown saying what's happened, he said the jails were all full. So he had to do something to make a court, and they called it the court of oyer and terminer, to listen and decide. Now this wasn't one of the regular courts. They usually had quarterly courts at town places, but this was just, it's too much, so I'm going to call a special court. And that is the court of oyer and terminer. Now you see we have 4 sittings of the court, 1 per month, right? And then it goes a little bit farther. That's because they were going to do another one in October. Except from all other accounts, you can tell it was extraordinarily cold. There were people petitioning to get out of jail because it was so cold. There were people not showing up because it was too cold. So they decided, okay, we're going to wait until the regular seating of the court comes around in January. So everything that was in the works here, they put on hold until they could start up in January. I'm thinking maybe January wasn't as cold as October. I don't know. Okay, so there were 4 different seatings then, and 3 more people were found guilty. 3 more. And finally they said, oh, when the girls are claiming affliction, they're saying, oh, I see the specter of Susanna North Martin, and she's hurting me, even if Susanna North Martin is in the room and, being held by the sheriff. So I see her specter, and she's biting me and choking me and all these things, practically dying. And that was called spectral evidence, and it fit into how the people at the time were seeing the world. They broke it down into the visible world and the invisible world, where God and the angels were. And there was that's real. And the devil was an angel, a fallen angel. So these things of the world were invisible, but they were very real. And you can't say, oh, they were just superstitious. No, this is just how the worldview was for them. And they looked into the universe. They looked at it. They saw comets. They were wondering if that was a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure. All sorts of things could be a sign of that. So when these girls were mentioning, specters coming at them, that's part of the invisible world, and people believed them. Also, when the girls claiming this would fall down on the floor or scream, and sometimes together in unison, they believed them because it was just so dramatic. Let's go on a little bit more. Here we go, another timeline. I love timelines. This is every single thing right there is a confession. And I've got a spike for every single day that there should be confession, accusation. So I color-coded them just a little bit, rather than have all those towns, which could get kind of confusing. I've just done yellow for Salem Village, green for Salem Town, and then Andover is red. 1/3 of the people who were accused of witchcraft were living in Andover. People forget that. They go, oh, why isn't the Andover witchcraft trials? No, the trials were in Salem. So as you look along here, in those first 3 months, there's a lot of yellow. There's a lot of yellow. That's when we have the Salem Village ones. And you don't see yellow over here. So it sort of fell off around the time that the governor arrived and they were starting to have the trials. Green, that's going to be your the rest of Salem, and you got a little bit of that over here. This big one here, this was right before they were about to start the trials, and it sounds like they just said, did we miss anybody? Because there are people from all sorts of different towns, and that's the first time we see somebody here from Andover. That was Martha Carrier. So this was, we're getting ready to prosecute. And then you see a big gap when they start doing it. And then by July, we're starting to get a few more people in there, and you can tell that the fall was really about the accusations in Andover. Yes, there were still plenty of others, but it was mostly Andover. The last trials took place in September. And even in October, we've got an accusation. And then these last things in November, there were 3 people who were accused. And if you're a fan of Who Do You Think You Are? The very first episode of the first season was Sarah Jessica Parker. And in the promos for it, it said, and she's descended from one of the last people accused of witchcraft in the Salem witchcraft trials. There's not much information about it, but doesn't that sound great? Yeah. So I went, I bet it's Esther Elwell. Because all these people are real people to me, because I've been doing this since 2000, actually a little bit before that. So I've been doing this a long time. Everybody in there is a person to me. For those of you, anybody here a fan of the show? Fan of Who Do You Think You Are? You should be. If you aren't already, I highly recommend it, because it's unlike documentaries. The documentaries I was in, basically somebody who doesn't know much about it makes a story arc, and then interviews experts for like 2 hours, and then takes little clips and puts it into their narrative. Who Do You Think You Are is completely different. They take a person, usually a celebrity, so you'll watch, and then they do genealogy and say, give us a certain amount of information, give us 2 weeks, and we'll get back to you to see if we can tell you a story. And they come up with stories based on that person and their ancestors. And the historians who are doing it are amazing. They read everything. They talk to all the right people. They ask all the right questions. And even on the morning of the way, morning of the recording, they say, if there's something you don't know, you say, you don't know. So I was always a fan of the show, and I went, wow, this is even better than I imagined. They really want to get it right. The one thing that I found a little weird was when they first pull up by someplace, there's usually no parking there. And what they do, like in Salem, Scott Foley was at the house, the Witch House, the Corwin House. Yeah, that's a huge intersection that you can't park there. So they had him drive up, get out and go to the door, and then they had somebody from the production company take the car away, go around the block, and they did it a second time. But there's no parking there. They make it all look very convincingly easy, which we all know if we do genealogy and history, it isn't. But they compress it all. They've done all that work. They give us a stack of the primary sources, and we tell them a story, showing all these primary sources. It is as wonderful as you imagine it would be. And don't you wish you were a celebrity that they'd have you on? Yeah. Although, let's see, they did have somebody, Allison Janney, and they have the things where she's standing on some rocks, and her ancestor was one of the first to come here and got shipwrecked in Bermuda. And I went, Stephen Hopkins. It was really easy. But they didn't tell her where they were going. They told her story. So anyway, that's my plug for Who Do You Think You Are? Let's get down to the nitty gritty when it comes to what happened. And we are so lucky on this particular thing that we have so many primary sources about it. Now, if you thought that somebody was afflicting your kid, you would complain to the magistrate. And this is actually a complaint to the magistrate with the order from the magistrates to arrest Rebecca Nurse. So here's the complaint that she'd done these things. Here's where the two justices, it's a local magistrate you could go to, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Corwin's house is the one I was talking about. It's still in Salem, and you can visit it. So they're ordering her to be arrested, and down here at the bottom, that's signed by the sheriff saying, yep. So they had said, bring her here to the meeting house on such a date at such and such a time, and the sheriff said, I have done that. So it's really kind of cool because you can see exactly who's telling who what to do under what authority. Once you got arrested, in the early ones, you were being brought to the meeting house, and if you go to the Rebecca Nurse homestead in Danvers, they have a reconstruction of the meeting house. I mean, there were directions with all of the dimensions of it in the historical record, and they made a new one when they were filming Three Sovereigns for Sarah. So you can actually go in and have a sense of the space. So what they would do is they would interrogate them. Now they call it an examination, but it's an interrogation. You know, Lenny Briscoe in the box. But they were doing it in public. And people were showing up, including the girls who were saying, she's biting me. But it was an interrogation. This is the one of Martha Corey. I'll go back here. This is actually 4 pages long. They really interrogated her for a long time. So it starts off, and the reason that it looks like a play and drama, well, that's what it was. It was question and answer, and that's why Arthur Miller picked up some of this. Every once in a while I'll hear the play and go, oh, wait a minute, that's from Bridget Bishop's interrogation. So it starts off, I got Hathorne saying, well, tell me now why you hurt these persons. Okay, that's a direct question. He's just, he already knows that she did it, and she knew that they were being afflicted. He just wants to know why. That's a leading question. And what do you do when somebody asks you about that? Well, she said, I do not. He goes, well, who doth? Who doth? Yeah, it's back in that era. And still means these kids are hurt. Somebody's doing it. I think you know who. And she says, pray, give me leave to go to prayer. Because she was a gospel woman. She was a fully covenanted member of the church in Salem Village. So that's nothing to sniff at. And she just wants to go to prayer. And of course he says, we do not send for you to go to prayer, but tell me why you have hurt these. So he's not letting up. And it goes on and on and on. At some point, somebody throws her muff at her and hits her in the head. Another point, a shoe was pitched at her. People are jumping up and saying things about, well, she did this, she did that. Of course they're not going to let her go. at the end, I'm an innocent person. I never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. What else do? You just have to keep refuting it, and they try to wear you down. The point of interrogations is to get you to confess, because confession was a gold standard piece of evidence. And Martha Corey didn't, but she was the fourth person who was arrested. I mentioned him before. This is the minister. This is Samuel Harris. I look at that. I went down to the Mass Historical Society to say, let's see. They have this portrait of him there. Can I go see it? And they said, sure. So I made an appointment, because that's what you do with archives, right? You make an appointment, you tell them what you want to see. And I thought it was a painting on the wall that I could go up to. I could look him in the eye, I'd have a sense. So I was sitting there, and this fellow came out with the white gloves and a little box.
Oh, yeah.
It was a little white box. And then he opened it up, and there it was. It was a miniature. And you can see from the top there's a hinge. Yeah, it was this big. And he was holding the box to show me. I was like, oh, this is weird. Yeah, this is what it is. Okay, I'm looking at it, and the guy's just sitting there holding it for me. I was like, can I see the back? Okay. It was weird. But I wanted to just look him in the eye. Who is this guy? But I also, some people really want to vilify him. I don't. He was concerned about his family more than anything else. One of the reasons that he took down the interrogations. You saw that little teeny handwriting and stuff like that. In that era, they did not have iPhones. I know that surprises you. They didn't have Memorex. But there were people who had the skill to write things down in shorthand. And it was a very popular thing to go hear somebody preach, or just on Sunday, and take notes. And some people use shorthand, and they could take down everything live. And it was a fairly common thing for very devout Puritans to do this and keep a sermon notebook so they could go back and read it, they can talk to their family about it, and he had that skill. And that's part of the reason that we know so much about those early accusations, because when they were interrogated in public, he wrote really detailed, accurate accounts. Well, some people didn't think they were entirely accurate, but he has this. So you actually hear the women saying, I am innocent. You can hear people protesting their innocence. Later on, when people were being interrogated, they didn't start writing things down until they, confessed. No, I'm innocent. Okay, I've been in the devil's snare for 6 years now, so you know that there's stuff you don't hear. But with him, you saw it all. And that really made these people come alive in the tellings of these stories. Once you have been interrogated, they didn't let you go. There's a reason why there were 70 people in that pink area of that timeline. They didn't let you go. They should have, but they didn't. They didn't believe that this gospel woman, a fully covenanted member of the church, we're going to keep her. They had the option of letting people go. You could put them out on bail or something, but they didn't put anybody out on bail. So one of the things about these documents is that you can tell the stories of individual people. There's nobody there at the very beginning who's there at the very end. So you can't just, I'm not going to tell you the story of this person, but I'm going to talk about what the process was. So you're going to see lots of different people's stories show up. This particular document is called a minimus, and it is an official document to move a prisoner from one place to the custody of somebody else. And this, look at it, end of May, there are a whole bunch of people here who they wanted to bring up from the prison in Boston to bring them up to Salem so that they could prosecute them. One of the nice things, well, here we go. There they are, and they're same two guys, is if you're interested in one of these people, this tells you when they were in jail, when they were moved, and dates. Places and dates. That's my, I love it. At first I thought this wasn't very interesting, and then I went, oh, look at all the information it gives me. You may see this name, Dorothy Good. Dorothy Good was 4 years old. And she was the daughter of one of those Sarahs, who was also, by the way, breastfeeding another child. So little Dorothy Good, she didn't come through this unscathed. Her life was a total disaster. And a friend, Rachel Christ-Doan, was writing a book about her, and it's so tragic that she was just 4 years old, chained in the dungeon. Okay, so once you're in jail, there are costs that accumulate. This particular document is a bill for the Boston prison, and it has all sorts of interesting things in it. The first ones have to do with buying chains for Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, 14 shillings. Blankets for Sarah Good's child, at least they were trying to keep her warm, right? And then we've got more shackles for 10 prisoners, £2. We even, I haven't got it in here, but we have blacksmith's bills for all of this because somebody had to pay the blacksmith to do this. Then all these other things down that whole right, those are all names of people, when they came into the jail, and how long they stayed, because somebody had to feed them. And this would have all that stuff, so you have a date and how long they were there. Awesome. More information. Then they have to have a court after that. Now this, I'm going to switch here to New Hampshire. This is Eunice Cole from Hampton. Anybody know anything about Eunice Cole? There's a barbecue place there, Goody Cole, get barbecue. Goody Cole, she was the neighbor from hell. She was always ranting and raving to people. She was doing all sorts of weird things, like trying to tempt the little girl next door, come live with me. You don't want her in your neighborhood. If she'd been a guy, you definitely not. But she was creepy, and she started causing problems to the point that she was constantly in the records. But this, they had her in jail in, what's this, 73, and they hadn't done anything. She's in custody, and here in New Hampshire they said, well, we really need, come on, set up a court to try her. This is a little bit of a deadline, excuse me, timeline. So she first, there we go, she first starts showing up in 1640, but she was accused of witchcraft 4 times in her lifetime. And she died in 1680, and that's not too far before the Salem trials. So she never was executed, but we see her a lot. I'll come back to her in a little bit. Also in Hampton in the 1680s, there was a woman named Rachel Fuller. And Rachel Fuller, there was a little baby next door who was not doing well. And she apparently showed too much interest. What do you think's ailing him? Sometimes so much that people are going, why does she want to know? She seems a little overly interested. And then she started calling her own baby by the same, little Moses. And they just thought that was weird. Now this is called a deposition. A deposition is testimony. And in those days you had to submit it in writing. Now, the woman who's submitting this does not say, I think she's a witch. She says, she did those things. And there was a record of her having done weird things. And then we can tell from this, little things, this meant it went to grand jury, and this meant it went to trial. And clearly she was found not guilty because the records disappeared at that point. This is a deposition from the Salem witchcraft trials, and this is, again, the apparition of John Willard. 25% of the people in just about all witchcraft cases are men. And he wasn't even married to anybody. If you were married to somebody being accused of a witch, well, you were vulnerable there, but he wasn't. They held him accountable, but not legally, for the death of somebody. So here he is accusing them, and yeah, can you see that the ink changes?
Oh, yeah.
Same handwriting. Well, that could be normal. They were making their own ink. It would have all been black, but it was called iron gall ink, so it had iron and oak galls. And some of these start looking a little orange from the iron. But this looks a little bit grayer. But when they wrote it, it was all black. Over time, they changed colors. So there are ordinary reasons why you might have 2 kinds of ink on it, right? You ran out. New batch. Not quite the same thing. It's not production line. Well, that's possible, if you hear whinnying and hoofs, you can go, oh, horse. But we found 17 of these depositions written by the same hand, Thomas Putnam, that had a break in exactly that same place. And an ink change. Ooh, is the right. So they all start also on and this is 18th May, being the day of his examination, I was most grievously tortured. Oh, really? Again, And they all start that way. Also on such and such a day, the day of his examination. Wait a minute, she's talking about what happened after he was arrested? Huh. Well, why would that be important? This is why it would be important. Because when you indict somebody, the indictment articulates what's the crime, who did it, when did they do it, when? Just about every single indictment indicts people for the day they were examined. There were witnesses. So they weren't even being tried on the reasons that they were arrested. They're being tried on what happened after they were arrested, in front of people. And that got around the little thing about having to have two humane witnesses to witness the same crime, because they had lots of people witnessing these crimes. So, and this one you can see the ink changes, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever had to do anything legally where they fill in the blanks. Well, this you put it into the computer, you got it. Well, they had scribes who would write the whole thing out and leave spaces. And the orange ink is from the prosecutor who was filling them in. So there are 4 of these for Rebecca Nurse's case, and they all have the same blanks and filled in with different victims. Yeah. Okay, so among things, you need other evidence. We've talked about the depositions. They would dig back in time. Your reputation could really haunt you. So Eunice Cole, a bunch of times, well, they dug out the records on her and said, yep, we already knew then you were a witch, but we're going to bring that information here, because just being a witch was illegal. So they dug things out, and you can see Vera Copia, a true copy. They didn't have Xerox machines, but they could actually make a new copy and submit it. And your reputation, you can't escape your reputation in those days. These days, people create a reputation for you, though. And you still, if somebody is doxxed these days, that's hard. She was being doxxed, basically, here. Now, there's also a line up here. They're talking about when they went to whip her, and they pulled back her blouse. It showed her breasts, and there was apparently something dangling from one of the breasts, and she brushed it away and it bled. And well, okay. And they were wondering if that was a teat. They believed that the devil, when he made a compact with a person to become a witch, would also issue them an imp, something to go with them. Now, we think about black cats, right? Well, it could be anything. It could be a cat, it could be puppies, it could be a snake, it could be a bird, it could be turtles. All sorts of things that it could be. But the idea was that somewhere on the witch's body, the imp needs a suckle. So they were looking, and they said, oh, was that a teat? So she was being looked at in that way. If you've seen this painting, because this gets used as an illustration, this painting was actually painted in 1853, so it's not what happened. But the idea was that here they are looking, oh, goodness. It's a new one. Okay, so it looks like they're looking, and there's an old woman pointing it out on this beautiful young woman. And look at all these people. They're falling down. Oh, heaven, and pointing, all this stuff. Something's going on. And this sounds like, oh, yeah, that's weird. Well, it's weird because it's not how it happened. They were examining the bodies of men and women separately. And examining the bodies of the women, they had a jury of women. It was called a jury of inquest. They're looking in to find facts. And they had a group of women examining the women's bodies with the doctor, and they had a group of men examining the men's bodies. The women, they always seemed to find a teat. Not always with the men, but they were finders of fact. Does this person have a teat? Here's one. This is a response for the women who were looking at several people, including, let's see, there we go, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and they claimed they did find them. And let's just say they were looking in their secret places. Yeah. Although there was somebody claimed to see a teat inside the cheek of somebody, and they said, well, how'd you see that? Well, I was up in the balcony and he yawned when I looked at it. But this was evidence. Also having any kind of evidence for telling fortunes. Now, this book is not from the trials, but it's an example of the kind of book that was imported from England. And this was doing palmistry, and there were 2 people in the trials who were accused of telling telling fortunes. One was Samuel Wardwell over in Andover, and there's a description of him holding the hand, looking down, looking up, and saying how many sons that this woman would have. And the other one was Dorcas Hoare. Now, 20 years before this, she'd had a book like this, and her minister told her, you have to get rid of it, which she did. Except 20 years later, minister saying, well, you know, she had that book of palmistry 20 years ago. So there was no getting out of that. Now, other things that might happen, people might die. Little Moses died, and they have to have a jury from the court with the coroner, and here, there we go, that's the little thing. These are the people who are on the jury that examined his body, and they say, well, knowing what we know and seeing the body, yep, we think he was killed by witchcraft. They don't have to explain why. They're just finders of fact. Was this death because of witchcraft or not? Did somebody have a teep or not? Because that was just finders of fact, it was evidence. You may have heard about ducking somebody, putting them in water. If they float, they're guilty, and if they sank, they're innocent. It wasn't used in Salem because two of the big ministers of the time, Cotton Mather and his father, Increase Mather, said, no. You know, it isn't just water. You know, everybody can go in the water. You know, it's just not a telling thing. The idea was that somehow the water was rejecting the evil people. But they didn't go for that. They went for the spectral evidence, but they didn't go for that. However, that same September of 1692, over in Connecticut, they did it. And in this case, let's see, Elizabeth Clausen, she buoyed up like a cork. Although, actually, there was actually another Who Do You Think You Are episode that they talked about guilty of witchcraft, and that was Elizabeth Clausen. But she was found not guilty. Mercy Desborough swam upon the water. Yeah, these aren't good things to happen during that. But Elizabeth Clausen was found not guilty, and Mercy Desborough was found guilty, but was spared through mercy. Yep.
Yeah, so the people who sank, were they retrieved or did they just die?
Oh, they didn't let people die. No, because if they let people die, that would be bad. But it's just like if you buoyed up, you know, if you're just splashing around and you can't get up, no. It wasn't a way to...
Okay, so this wasn't a no-win situation.
No. But they weren't using it. I mean, this particular, let's see, that picture thing I showed you, that was from a case in England in the early 1600s. So it was around. People knew about it. But the Mathers just went, nah, we don't think so. Now, all this stuff gets recorded in a court record book. We do not have the court record book from the Court of Oyer and Terminer. This is from the regular court that you saw in blue on that far end of the timeline. There are a lot of people who say, why don't we have the one from the Court of Oyer and Terminer, like it's some big secret? And go, well, you know, I bet it was used a lot because afterwards there were people who were appealing their cases. So it had to get used. But, you know, there was, well, they probably didn't do one. No. Puritans liked writing things down. Oh, maybe they were too embarrassed and they got rid of it. They weren't embarrassed. At a certain point, they knew they'd done something wrong, but they had the records. So I hope someday something shows up. But to the best of my understanding, later on when they were looking at, you know, different cases and saying, yeah, we did it wrong, they had to have copies from that book. So it existed. This particular one is from when the trials restarted in January. And it tells you some stuff. I mean, that tells you when it was, who the judges were, then the grand jury members, the trial jury members, then it copies the indictment. We already have that. And then down here it talks about how she was found not guilty. Okay, yeah, but what happens? Once you are found not guilty, you still have to pay your jailer's fees. And you're only let out of jail after you pay your fees. And one woman, Sarah Dustin, couldn't pay her fees. She was found not guilty and she was still in jail and she died there. Yeah. So, and what happened to our friend Eunice Cole? Well, not legally guilty according to the indictment.
Oh.
Really? But, let's see, what is this? But just proven, let me see if I can write here. But just ground of vehement suspicion of having had familiarity with the devil. Is that we still think she's a witch, but we couldn't prove it in court. If you were found guilty, it was a capital crime, so they would hang you. And this is actually the document that was written to hang the first person who was executed, Bridget Bishop. So again, it repeats all the charges against them, and then with that seal here, the chief magistrate made it official and says, tells the sheriff, bring her to the place of execution on the date and time specified, and hang her by the neck until she's dead. No burning. Hang her by the neck until she's dead. And like that other one, down here, the sheriff said, I have brought her to the place of execution on the given date, July 19th, and time, and I have hanged her by the neck until she was dead. The place of execution, several of my friends, they did all the research, and they really have said it's at Proctor's Ledge on Gallows Hill in Salem, and there's now a memorial there. But it wasn't at the top of Gallows Hill, it was probably a tree. And that's the reality of it. They hanged 19 people. And then Giles Corey pressed to death. So who's this guy? Who's this guy? William Stoughton. I'm writing a book about him, so I know more about him than anybody else on the planet. Please don't hold your breath for it to come out, because I like doing research. So he went to Harvard, and he gave Harvard that building, Stoughton Hall. The Stoughton Hall that's in Harvard Yard now is the second version of it, but he gave £1,000 to Harvard for doing it. Now, I sort of let Samuel Parris off the hook. I can't let him off the hook, because Rebecca Nurse is found not guilty. The jury turned a not guilty verdict, and he wouldn't accept it. He sent them back to redeliberate. They came back and said, no, we still think she's not guilty. And then he pointed out something that had happened at the trial, something she'd said, and said, well, you can interpret it this way, that she's admitting. So they went, okay. So I hold him individually, personally responsible for the execution of my ancestor. He should have accepted the not guilty verdict. But since it was the second round of trials, you know, if he'd let that go, that would just cause all sorts of chaos. So he didn't. They weren't letting people out on bail, still all in jail. But finally, in the beginning of October, they started letting children out of jail. And these are several children from Andover. Stephen Johnson was 13, Abigail Johnson was 10, and little Sarah Carrier was 8. They're all in jail. And finally, it's October, it's so cold, they're saying, can we bail them out? Because our friend Rachel Fuller from Hampton, she was let out on bail for £100, and that was a fairly common thing. And so they just said, please, let's get these kids out. So their fathers and the wealthiest person in Andover put up the money. How much? £500. Wow. £500. Just so you know, a minister would make maybe £70 a year. What would that be? And these saying, well, it'll be thousands and thousands of dollars for 3 little kids. Before they were through in October, they let out 8 kids. Some of them were £500 each. So it was about £2,500 bail to let 8 kids out in October. And they hadn't let any adults out. By the time we get to December, they're starting to let adults out for that same regular £100 and children for $50. But this is the first time they actually let anybody out. We know a lot about this particular judge, Samuel Sewell, because just a couple of years after the witch trials were over in 1696, there was a day of fasting, and he presented a document to his minister in Boston, in which part of what he said, he's desired to take the shame and the blame of what happened. So Sewell's apology is a big deal. Although, I have to say, on that court, with all the judges, he was the youngest. He was the most junior member on that bench. So I don't know that he could have done anything different. Who's the head of it? William Stoughton. 20 years older than this guy. But people know about him because there's a record. And they'll turn it around and say he was the only person who admitted he'd done anything wrong. Well, he's a person. You don't know about the rest of them. You just don't. Just because you don't have a record of it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But that's 1696, so it's not that long after the trial's over, and people were realizing they'd done something wrong. Something had gone horribly wrong. In addition, when we get to about 10 years out, people are saying, well, I need to have my conviction overturned. Not even just the conviction. Once you are sentenced, you are in a strange state. You have a attainder attached to you. You cease to be somebody who, you don't have no civil rights. You're dead in the eyes of the law. So there was people who were convicted and sentenced who never got sentenced, and they're living under this, and it was causing problems. So they were applying to get a reversal of attainder. And they did a lot of them. Not everybody came up to ask for one. Sometimes the family had moved away, because you could do this for people who'd been executed. But sometimes if you didn't come up and say, I want this done, it didn't happen. And in the 50s and most recently, they still have been trying to get those overturned. And it was just a couple of years ago that a bunch of middle schoolers in North Andover, remember, North Andover's where it happened, had a class project. They discovered that there was one person, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who was a teenager, who was convicted in that stuff that started in January, but somehow she was overlooked in all these other things. So as a class project, these 8th graders went to the legislature and got her conviction overturned. So she was exonerated. So that just tells you how long. That was just a couple of years ago. So it took a while for that to happen. And then when we get into a little bit farther on, we're seeing that people say, well, I lost things. So once you have that attainder attached to you, all sorts of other things could happen. That's when the sheriff can come and take all your stuff. It wasn't land, if you heard, it's a land grab. No. There would be evidence in deeds, because they were particular about land. But the sheriff could come and take all your movable goods, your goods and chattels, everything in your house, everything in your barn, everything in your sheds, everything in your fields, and sell it for the crown, for the benefit of the crown. And they did some of that. So this is the Wardwell family, and we're talking about 1710, so we're about 20 years out, and they're saying, well, we lost a whole lot of stuff. The sheriff came and took this. So this is my fun slide. Just so you know. 5 cows, a heifer and a yearling, a horse, and 9 hogs. So that gives you an idea of what kinds of things that the sheriff was taking. And I'm sorry, that's enough livestock for a small farm. Right? Not only that, he took the hay in the barn. He took the guy's carpentry tools. Now, this is an illustration from Eric Sloan of hand tools for carpentry. So these are the kinds of tools. They hadn't changed that much until we started getting electricity, but this is the kind of tools he would have had. Took the corn from the field. That way you know it was September, right?
Yes.
So everything. He took everything. And he asked for 36 pounds, 15 shillings. This is his son. That's what he wanted compensation for. Most of the people were asking for compensation for the few shillings it took to get a copy of their court record out of that book that doesn't exist anymore. And there were a lot of people, I had to travel to Boston and things like that. Usually it was a few shillings. Lucky if it got into a pound or two. But this was 36 shillings and 36 pounds, 15 shillings. So that was a lot. But then they asked William Good. William Good was Sarah Good's husband. She was one of the first people accused. She was executed in July 1692. And this is also the father of little Dorothy Good. So they asked him, what compensation can we give you? And he wrote, my wife, Sarah Good, was in prison above 4 months and executed. A sucking child, remember I said she was breastfeeding, died in prison before the mother's execution. And a child of 4 or 5 years old was in prison 7 or 8 months, and being chained in the dungeon was so hardly used and terrified that she had ever since been very chargeable with little or no reason to govern herself. He says, I leave it to the honorable court to judge what damage I have sustained by such a destruction of my family. And, let's see, there we go, 30 pounds. So for me, this is the kind of document that you just see it and your heart breaks. And you understand what the witchcraft trials were about. It's not about wearing pointy hats and doing things in Salem and running around and having fun. This is the human cost. And I always end with this one because of that. I'm going to add a little teeny bit. I'm almost at my hour. This particular document was at Cornell University. They have a large witchcraft collection, but it's usually stuff about European witch hunts. And then this document sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. And I wondered, why is it there? So I looked up things on their online catalog, and at one point it said in the folder was this document, a page from the bookseller who was selling it in 1913, and then it said, and 2 letters. Letters? It didn't say what they were. So I contacted them and said, what are those letters? And they digitized them and sent them to me. And they turned out to be letters from a fellow at the Essex Institute, one of the institutions that ended up being the Peabody Essex Museum. And it was from this guy at the Essex Institute talking to the guy at Cornell. The guy at the Essex Institute is Dow, the guy at Cornell is Burr. And says, hey, I see that you got that document, paid $85 for it. So he started talking. I said, well, I wonder if we have the other side of that correspondence. So I contacted the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum and I said, hey, any chance you have anything from Burr to Dow in 1913? And it turns out places like this have institutional archives. It's not like, the archives of these things. But they looked, and sure enough, they found 2 letters from the guy at Cornell to the guy at the Essex Institute. So I have this nice correspondence in which they admit that it really belongs to the state of Massachusetts. It should be in the public custody. And, well, it's a good thing that, he got it, so, it can be in a collection instead of going into the hands of a private collector. And so I went, oh, so they knew. They were supposed to give it back. They can't own it. So, were we talking about Jeremy? Yeah, this is a really great guy at the Massachusetts Archives, State Archives. His name's Jeremy. And I approached him. I said, I got this set of correspondence that says they knew. What do you think about asking Cornell to get it back? So he did. And he wrote letters to them and explained and sent them. I put together a whole package with all these letters and stuff. And they wrote to them, and they said, oh, well, okay, we received your stuff. They did ask how he'd found out about this. All they have to do is look at their records. They knew I'd asked about those letters. But I don't know if I can go to Cornell anymore. But they only had that one document I cared about. Anyway, they said, okay, we're going to have to review this. And it got reviewed by the archivist. So it took several months, but they said, okay, our librarians and archivists seem, yes, this is right. But then, had to have the lawyers look at it. It took a year. It took a year. And they really wanted the lawyers to look at it. And finally they delivered it in a beautiful box. They had done all sorts of conservation of it. It had all sorts of things with labels and stuff like that. But they did return it. Now, I don't know why that hasn't made the news, but, we'll repatriate things to other cultures, but how about we repatriate things within our own culture?
Yeah.
So, just so you know, I have my eye on a bunch of things at the Mass Historical Society, and I got a little story for that. But they're legal papers, so I have to go to the judicial archives. And they're interested too. But, trying to find something asking for, 24 documents from the Massachusetts Historical Society, they're not going to want to do it. One thing from Cornell, yeah. Oh, there's one at Yale too. So I'm keeping track of the ones that aren't in public custody and trying to get them repatriated. So I'm sure I'm not going to be a person that any archive wants near them. So, but I got this one back to where it belongs. So I thank you very much. Take questions. Take questions. Okay, what? Yes, right here.
Can you speak to what I found in my records? The fact that the husband of my ancestor,
Who was
Mary Osgood.
Mary Osgood.
Clemens
Mary,
Osgood.
okay.
Her husband, they were prominent apparently in the community, but he verified her confession.
Now the Osgoods in Andover?
I think it was Danvers,
Mm,
but
the
I'm
Os-
not sure.
well, there was one case with Martha Corey where her husband said, yeah, I saw something suspicious. Duh. But over in Andover, they got a lot of people to confess. And I don't believe he endorsed it. People in Andover, if you hear me say, oh, we gotta learn from history so we don't have horrible things happen, I'm sorry, horrible things happen. Because people are mean. Neighbors are not necessarily nice people. But, these things can happen. But,
Well, what it said from the family version of what came down through the family was that
I'll fill you in. She's looking at family records.
one of the reasons that husbands did that was because it was a chance that the person might not come.
Ah, okay, we're getting to the heart of it.
Yeah.
She says in her records, the husband sort of supported the charges against her so that she would confess, right?
Yes.
Okay, this is one of the things that comes out there. There's so many things that I hear about and go, oh no. The idea is that if you confessed, you weren't gonna hang. Because nobody who confessed was hanged. Right? That's looking back and looking at the result. Those people didn't know. And also, you would think, how did they figure this out? And I started looking at the timeline. The people who confessed were in Andover, most of them. And they didn't know what was going to happen. But it was a culture of confessing your sins and things like that. But it was not going to let you off. It was not going to let you off. As a matter of fact, in January, Stoughton had already written another warrant to hang people, among them confessors from Andover. So it sounds kind of nice. Hey, you confess and you can get off. I'm sorry, you're going to confess to a capital crime? No. Here in New Hampshire, it's still a capital crime to kill a police officer. And, well, we aren't executing people now, but it's still a capital crime. And if you don't think that you could hold on to your innocence under 2 or 3 days of interrogation by FBI people who do interrogations all the time, they'll get you to confess to anything. The tactics that police officers are trained in are designed to get you to confess. They catch you on a little something and then you start thinking it over. False confessions are huge, but you weren't going to get let off. As a matter of fact, confession was the gold standard for evidence. And people like to say, oh, well, they confessed so they could get off. Well, that also means that people who didn't confess, what's going on with them? Oh, well, they didn't want to belie themselves just to live. I'm sorry. I don't think we had martyrs there. We had victims. Because if you could say, oh, I confess, and not have to hang, you'd think more people would have changed their minds. One person that did confess under duress was Samuel Wardwell. And then what they do at trial is they say, okay, sign this confession that this is what your confession was. He said, nope, I said it, but it's not true. And there was an indictment for confessing. There was another indictment for that. And they indicted him and they convicted him on that. So, yeah, it's a little convenient to think that, oh, if I confess to this horrific crime, I'm going to go free. No. So, it's a lovely story, but, yeah. And it's one we want to believe, right? Yeah. Okay, back there.
I grew up in Framingham, and there was a road called Salem End Road.
Yep.
And the story was that some of the houses there had hidden rooms behind fireplaces. And do you know anything about that?
Yes, I do. She's asking about some of the families who were accused in Salem ending up in Framingham, and there's a road called Salem End. Is that it? Yeah. I know that the Cloyces, that's Rebecca Nurse's and Mary Estes' sister, the Cloyces went to Framingham, and there is a house still standing there that the basis of it had been the Cloyce house. I don't know what you can do with it now. At one point it was gonna get torn down, and then it was gonna be a B&B, and I don't know what it is now. All of those old houses that have multiple chimneys and the flue, you could usually get on the inside of it anyway, because that's where they'd have to be to fix the bricks. So, but there were a lot of people who left Salem rather than stick around.
Yeah.
So, over here?
So why wasn't 4-year-old Dorothy Good remanded to her father?
Ah, good question. Why wasn't little Dorothy Good remanded to her father? Notice that they didn't bail anybody out. They didn't bail any kids out until October. So they should have, but they didn't.
But she wasn't accused, the little one wasn't accused.
Oh, she was accused.
Oh, she was?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And she confessed. Imagine trying to get a 4-year-old to confess to anything. Yeah, false confessions. I mean, the people who were low level in their communities, like Tituba, they got her to confess. She was a slave. Why wouldn't she? Little Dorothy Good. They got people who were described, there's one woman, simplish at best. They got a lot of people to confess, but they also really got full covenanted members of the church in Andover to confess. It was the goal to do that. Yeah.
And, were there any people that confessed that were nonetheless executed?
Yes. That would be Samuel Wardwell. He wouldn't sign that. Yes, this is my confession. He said, yes, I wrote that, but it's not true. So he was executed.
Were there any others?
No, that's the only one. But remember, we say, oh, well, the people who confessed didn't get hanged. We know that. How would they have known it before? That's one of those historians' fallacies, that because we know the outcome, we don't know what they knew.
Yeah.
So, another question over here? Yep.
So why 350 years later, thereabouts, this myth of witches being burned at the stake, why is that still
Why do we get
out
that
there?
myth? Yeah, it's 334 years later.
I was rounding down.
Well, last year's really nice, 333. What about the stuff about them being burned? Well, over in Europe, that was the punishment, to kill people. So a lot of people will say, well, if they burned them there, they burned them here. But also, it's really interesting, because I love history, during the Civil War, when there were a lot of debate between the slaveholders and the abolitionists, the slaveholders reignited the notion that the witches in New England were burned. So they're saying, oh, you say we're old-fashioned, we have slaves. Well, you burned witches. And that's what they used rhetorically. And that's inflammatory language, but it gets passed down. It's sort of like, oh, they hanged witches. That doesn't sound as bad as burning them, does it? So not too many people are really looking at all the specific things, but you will hear that they were burned. But that particular document that Stoughton wrote, hanged by the neck until dead. But it seems a little more dramatic to say they were burned. But that was Europe. Anybody else right here?
So who ended up with that document? Essex or the Massachusetts Historical?
You want to know where that document?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the one that
That's
goes
now
right on.
at the Massachusetts State Archives.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, because they own it.
Yeah.
They own it. And all these people, these collectors who have things out there,
Yeah.
yeah, no. And of course, at one point I was telling this story, and this guy in the back went, so, I know this guy who's a collector, and I knew he's had a couple of these documents, which he shouldn't have. Every once in a while they come up for auction. He said, so would the state buy it? And I went, no, it's the state's stuff. They want it back. So I'm going, oh, he's going to go tell that collector, isn't he? Oh, well. One more back here, yep.
You mentioned Cotton Mather. What was his role in the trials?
Cotton Mather was a young, brilliant minister. His father was very famous. Increase Mather was just, they called them divines. But Cotton Mather was a friend of just about all these people, and he was trying to make sense of it from a religious point of view. He didn't think you could do the swim test. And at the end, he showed up at one of the executions. But then later on, when people were starting to say, well, I think we did something wrong, he published a book called Wonders of the Invisible World. And in it, he wrote about 5 different cases. He went to the clerk of the court and got a bunch of the documents. He gave them all back, I checked. And he wrote stories about 5 of the people. And none of those had spectral evidence in it. And what he was trying to do was defend the court And he asked William Stoughton, is this okay? Can I get your blessing for it? And Stoughton gave the blessing for it. But all 5 of the cases were people that they didn't have spectral evidence. And that was supposed to be, a defense of the court, and he wrote it. And then a few years later, somebody who didn't like him, Robert Califf, produced more Wonders of the Invisible World, copying everything in Wonders of the Invisible World, but then a whole chapter about what had gone wrong. So the reason we know that Rebecca Nurse was found not guilty is that he'd gotten the jurors, the foreman of the jury told him what had happened. And Rebecca Nurse said, when I said something, that was because I couldn't hear. Because it was so rowdy in the room, because I'd already been found not guilty, I couldn't hear what I was being asked a question. So we have additional documents that come through. John Alden, the son of John Alden, and who's the other one? Priscilla Monk. John Alden Jr. Was accused, and he got an account of that where he describing how they made him go outside because it was too dark in the meeting house. Everybody was peering in the windows. They made him stand outside on a chair, and the girls were pointing at him. And one of the judges, who'd known him for a long time, he said, "Come on, Bartholomew, you know me. You know this isn't right." And Gedney sort of went, "Well, I wouldn't have, but now I do." So we have accounts like that that Califf put together. But we also know that Califf really hated Cotton Mather. There's a lot of documentation of that. But he was trying to really defend what had gone on. But I think you got stained by it. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much for everything.